It was in probably about the 1950s in Appalachian country. There was this guy that had just gotten a new job. His job was to go along in the area, go off into the hills and the hollers and the different farms, and he had gotten a job as a tractor salesman. And so he was wandering around out through trying to figure out how to sell some tractors when he came upon this farmer that was out in one of the valleys. This farmer that was out with a team of horses plowing a field. And boy, you could see his eyes light up when he, farmer, horses, I can sell this guy a tractor for sure. So he goes over and finds stuff that says, "Good fella, have I got good news for you. I've got just the thing for you. I'm going to make your world so much easier. I'm a tractor salesman." The guy says, "I don't need one." I said, "What?" "Well, I got two of them in the shed over there." And he pointed over in the corner, and there they were, two tractors sitting there in the shed. So the poor salesman, in his disappointment, he says, "Good man, why in the world are you out here toiling away with these two horses when you could be using one of your tractors?" He said, "Well, it's like this. I'm just reminding old Bill and Bob here that there's more to farming than hanging around at the feed trough and chasing the mares around the corral. Farming, more to it. You see, if you're going to have your animals, you got to keep them in shape. You got to keep them working so they don't forget everything that goes with it. And if you're going to be a farmer, then be a farmer. Don't just sit on the sidelines." And even had said, "I got to remind my horses of that." Well, okay. Would you take your Bibles? Turn with me, if you would, to the Gospel of John, the last chapter in the Gospel of John. I call it the Epilogue. Actually, I don't know quite what's going on here. John chapter 20, the last two verses. "And truly Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in the book, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name." Now, doesn't that look a little bit like an ending? Doesn't that feel like a summing up and an ending to the book? And then you turn, and there's chapter 21. And after these things, you say, what is this? It looks like old John is kind of like some preachers you might know, You ever heard the old story? Some preachers are kind of like a pilot. They bring the plane down and go, "Whoa, maybe we ought to go again." Kind of do that thing. What's happening here? Why is this added on as a tag along? What is this? And could I suggest, even though it seems like kind of and we can look at chapter 21 and we'll be able to come up with a pretty good reason why that got added to the book. But I'll tell you, I'm sure glad that story got added. Okay? I'm sure glad there's a chapter 21. Have you ever had an oopsie in your life? Have you ever had an oopsie in your Christian experience? Have you ever had your Christian experience be, everything is going good and I've got this now? Maybe I was struggling before, but now I'm a new Christian and I've got this thing all settled up and everything's going right. And have you ever fallen flat on your face? Have you ever struggled with something? Now, this story in the Bible is sitting there really for the ones that have been the scandal. If you've really been if you haven't been there, you don't know what it feels like to be, and have everybody staring. And maybe even with a little bit of contempt. And maybe you've looked at the bathroom mirror and thought, oh man, I can't believe I made this kind of a mess. What is this? For anybody that has struggled with, I had high expectations and I thought I was past this problem and man, this story is for you. Chapter 21. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, and in this way he showed himself. Simon Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, the sons of Zebedee. Who are the sons of Zebedee? Who's that? Who are those guys? Sons of Zebedee, that's James and John. Okay? So there's several of the disciples that are here. And a couple of other guys that we're not even sure which ones they are. So you got about half of the disciples here. Now remember where you're at in time. Jesus has been on the cross. Jesus has been resurrected. Jesus is kind of functioning along. They're wondering about if they're in retirement. Jesus isn't seemingly going to need them with him anymore. And then there's Peter. Oh, Peter. Is it fair to say that Peter has experienced having a bad day? You know, the evening before Jesus was crucified, Peter had a bad day. What happened? You know the story. Peter gets caught. People recognized his accent from where he hung from. And somebody said, oh yeah, you're one of those guys that were hung out with that Jesus guy. You're one of those. And Peter said, not me. Pressure was on. Stress was high. Jesus was being torn to pieces. And Peter said, I don't need this. Get me out of here. And so he's kind of hanging at a distance. And then somebody says, hey, I know you. You're one of the... And Peter says, I don't need this. And he politely kind of says, nah, you must have me mistaken for somebody else. Then somebody comes along, hey, I know you. You're one of... And Peter's getting tired of it. The stress is getting higher. The harassment of Jesus is getting worse. This is not a good place to be. And Peter kind of says, well, no, I'm not one of them. I didn't know him. And finally somebody else says, hey, I know you. You're one of them. In fact, your even accent gives it away that you're from the same area. Yeah, you. And Peter decides, oh, you want to hear my accent? You want to hear my vocabulary? Let me explain to you in language that you can understand that I am not one of them with this guy. And about then the rooster crowed, which Jesus had told him would happen. And how do you think Peter's feeling right about now? And here we are, a few days later. How do you think Peter is feeling right about now? Have you ever let somebody down? Have you ever let somebody down you loved? How do you think Peter's feeling right about now? And notice, if you will, what it says. Verse 3, and Simon Peter said to them, I'm going fishing. And they said, yeah, let's go. We're going too. What is he saying when he's saying, I want to go fishing? This is not your typical, oh, I've had a bad day. Let's go to the fishing hole for a while and just kind of forget everything is, let's just go and kind of get our thoughts together by the lake. Well, that's not what he's saying. What he's saying is, oh, by the way, what was Peter's career before? What career had he put away when Jesus said, I want to make you fishers of men? Peter was a fisherman. What Peter is saying here is, this Jesus thing hasn't worked out for me. And furthermore, I've blown it pretty badly. There's nothing left for me to do but go back to making my living as a fisherman. I've blown it. I'm beyond repair. Christianity is doing well. Jesus is just back to life. This thing is going well. It's time for me to go back to fishing. How did he do that night? How much did they catch? Man, he couldn't even catch a minnow. Like, what? And you follow the story, and they come back, and they're coming to land. They've been fishing all night. They're tired. How do you think Peter's feeling right about now? Man, I am such a failure, I can't even catch a fish. Caught nothing. And they see somebody kind of standing there on the shore, but it's no big deal except that Peter doesn't want to see anybody. He just, leave me alone. Leave me alone in my failures. And what does the guy say? Why don't you try sticking the net in on the other side of the boat? Well, and remember Peter can be kind of feisty, and remember he can be kind of mouthy. Man, he doesn't even have any fight left in him to explain to the person, why don't you go have your breakfast someplace else and leave me alone? He doesn't even have any fight left in him. Whatever. Throw the net in and pandemonium breaks out. I mean, pandemonium breaks out. What do you do with all of this? And they're straining and pulling on the net. And finally, John seems to catch on first, and he says, who do you think that is standing there on the water? You know, over there on the seashore. Who do you think that is? And Peter goes and dives in and jumps in and goes in. But notice what happens. Verse 10, what does Jesus say? Bring some of the fish you've caught. Peter went up dragging and set the net full of large fish, a whole bunch of them. Can't even figure out how the net kept from breaking. There's so much. Jesus says, come and eat breakfast. They all know who it is. And Jesus then came and took the bread and gave it to them, and likewise the fish. And watch how Jesus deals with Peter. And notice, if you will, that the whole discussion is right there just for Peter. But it's not just for Peter, because he's kind of been somewhat the self-appointed leader of the group. Why is Jesus doing this publicly instead of privately? And what is Jesus doing here? Notice what happens. Verse 15. When they had eaten breakfast, Jesus says to Peter, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these? What did Jesus just ask him? Do you remember? It's in Matthew 26. Matthew 26. Well, I'm blank on my verse. The point is this. What happens? Jesus is talking to the disciples, and what does Peter say? Peter says, these other guys might not be ones that you can count on, but you can count on me. I'll be here with you, baby. I'll stand here. I'll even die for you. Jesus says, before the crow squawks 3 times, you'll have blown it. Peter goes, nah, not me. You're right. He even goes out of his way. He says, you're right. The rest of these guys, they're not worth anything. You can't count on any of them worth anything. But man, you got number one here. You got number one here. And now who has blown it and blown it bad? And not only does Jesus want to talk to Peter, but notice what's the first thing he asks him. You love me more than these? Took him right back to that experience when he was extra arrogant and saying, I'm the one you can count on. Jesus basically asked him, so how's it going, buddy? How's it going on this subject? And notice he did it publicly, in front of the other dudes. Why did he do that? Why did he do that? Well, back to our story. Chapter 21 in John. Why does Jesus do this? And notice, if you will, Jesus does it 3 times. Do you love me? Peter says, yeah. And Jesus said, tend to my sheep. And then he asks him again. And then he asks him a 3rd time. And the 3rd time, the original language, the Greek, they have more than one word for that we use for the word love. We talk about love. We say, do you love me? That can mean anything from hello or goodbye to anything. The Greeks have 6 different words for the word love. And Jesus doesn't use the 3rd time. He asks the do you really love me, as far as do you really love me in that wonderful all experience, all encompassing, do you love me? And that one really sticks with Peter. Peter finally says, Lord, you know I do. Now can I ask you a question? Why this story? What's going on here? I'd like to suggest to you what Jesus was doing was rehabilitating Peter. Peter had decided he'd committed the unpardonable sin. He had made the worst possible disaster you possibly could, and he was done being a disciple. He knew he wouldn't count for anything anymore. And notice what Jesus is doing. Jesus is taking him at the bottom. And notice what Jesus said to him every time he asked him, Peter, do you love me? Jesus said, feed my sheep, feed my lambs, tend my sheep. What is he saying? What did Jesus call Peter to when he was at the boats with his... Jesus said, follow me and I will make you fishers of men. Jesus is saying, Peter, you may have given up on yourself, but I have not given up on you. And notice Jesus is not only saying that to Peter, but Jesus is saying that publicly in front of the other disciples for them to see and to hear. We have not given up on Peter. So what looks like first impression, what looks like it's Jesus is humiliating him in front of everybody. What Jesus is actually doing is picking him up in front of everybody. Picking him up. You may have given up on yourself, Peter. Yes, you have made a major disaster. We're not denying that. But we are saying, Well, can I put it in the way of the song? So you had a bad day. So you had a bad day. And how about if we pick up? When you pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and start all over again. Wow. Notice, if you will, Jesus didn't say, "You're beyond hope." And notice, Jesus did not even say, "I can't use you in your ministry anymore." Jesus is saying, let's come right back and pick you up, and let's put you right back in the business of following Jesus and being in the fisherman for souls business. Wow. Now, why is this story even there? That's kind of comical too. Notice, if you will, at the end of chapter 20, it says Jesus did a lot of miracles. We don't have them all written down. We don't know all the stories of what Jesus did. And they're not all written down. Jesus did a bunch of miracles. It looks like this story wasn't even one that even rated as being one to be in the books. But it kind of gets tacked on the end. Why? Could I suggest read the story? Read through chapter 21, and it explains why. Why does this get tacked on? Could I even put it in the category, would you go to Romans chapter 8? And verse 28. And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purposes. Now notice what it says and what it doesn't say. All things work together for good to those that love God. That does not say that God worked out the bad things to happen. Okay? Did God want Peter to blow it like that so that God could rehabilitate him? No. But God can take even the worst situation and turn it into something good, even though it was a disaster. That's what it's saying. God can take something bad and turn it into something good. Even when we mess it up badly, God can turn it into something good, even though it doesn't look like it at the time. Okay? Notice it says, you keep reading on the next few verses in Romans 28, nothing can separate us from the love of God. Nothing can separate us from the love of God. Not disasters, not even death. Nothing can separate us from the love of God. Even though we might feel like we're being completely separated, nothing can separate us from the love of God. Even our own disasters. Now go back to John 21. What's that thing even doing there? Why did this story even get written down? It's kind of an accident. Notice what Jesus tells Peter. Verse 17. And Jesus said to him a third time, Simon, do you love me? Peter grieved because he said to him the third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know. And Jesus said, feed my sheep. Then Jesus says, most assuredly I say to you, when you were younger, you girded yourself, you walked where you wished. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will gird you and carry you where you do not wish. This he spoke, signifying by what death he would glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he said, follow me. Now you catch what's going on here? Jesus is saying, even telling him how he was going to die was an incredible part of the rehabilitation of Peter. How had Peter just done under stress? How had he just done under stress? not real well. Can we say that? Pretty good disaster. Pretty much Peter folded under pressure. What was Jesus telling him here when he told him, Peter, you're going to die for me? Jesus just told Peter, you're going to hang on and you're going to hold on to your faith stronger than you ever would have imagined. Peter probably would have told you right now, no, I won't. I'm a guy that failed. Remember, I'm a failure. I flubbed it up. I do whatever. And Jesus is saying, you're going to stand by me and I can count on you completely. You're going to die on a cross just like I did. You're going to stand firm this time. You're not going to fold. Confidence, prophecy. Peter, you've experienced conversion. You've experienced strength. You're not going to fold this time. But he got some bad news. That's a little bit stressful on how you're going to die. And what does Peter say? What's the next thing Peter says? The next verse. Peter turns around, he sees John, and he says, what about that guy? What about him? How's he going to die? Now, have you ever been around excuses? How do you notice what's going on here? Peter's starting to feel a little uncomfortable. Why don't we talk about how John's going to die? Why don't we talk about, okay? And notice how Jesus dealt with an excuse. Jesus deals with an excuse, and he just says, what's it matter if he doesn't die at all? What's it matter if you translate it? You follow me. Now, Jesus had to do it this way for a pretty easy reason. When Peter's in excuse mode, what would have happened if Jesus had said, well, John's going to die an old man out of old age? One of two things is going to happen, probably both. What's human nature going to say with that one? That's not fair. And then we're off on another side tangent doing whatever, okay? And if Jesus would have answered that one, well, yeah, he's going to die of old age, and Peter would have said, oh, okay, what's the next question? Well, what about Thomas there? What's going to happen with him? What's going to happen with these other guys? What's going to happen with them? The issue was not Peter. The issue was Peter. The issue was not John. The issue was not Thomas. The issue is not somebody else. The issue is, Peter, I'm talking to you. I can almost see Jesus smiling and say, Peter, I'm trying to rehabilitate you in front of your friends here. Will you please stop getting in my way? Will you please stop trying to change the subject? I'm trying to help you here. By the way, right there is the reason the story gets put in the Bible in the first place. Keep reading. Verse 23. Then this saying went out among the brethren that this disciple would not die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he would not die, but he said, if I will that he remain till I come, what is that to you? Do you see what's going on? The rumors going out all over the place. John writes his book when he is an old man. Why did he add chapter 21 on there? He had to. He had to. Because John is getting up in age. What would have happened if John had not corrected the rumor? What would have happened in the Christian church if John had died? What would have happened? John has to drag himself up off of his retirement bed and say, guys, Jesus did not say that I won't die. In fact, John says, I probably will. And John says, and if I die, that has nothing to do with the promises that Jesus made of his coming and coming soon. And John says, we better add that to the book that I wrote about the story of Jesus, because I don't want anybody being able to say, John died and Jesus promised he won't. Therefore, Jesus is a liar, or he was wrong, or he isn't really. You know how these crazy rumors go, don't you? Crazy rumors go. One happened in the Adventist church, kind of like that. 20th century, a big named pastor was HMS Richards Jr. The guy started a radio program in Los Angeles. He did it in 1929 when people were saying, oh, that radio, I wouldn't have that nasty thing in my house. I wouldn't have anything to do with that nasty thing. The devil's using that thing, and he started preaching on the radio. Woo, controversial. But it worked so well that others started, you've gone from rebel to positive when they, instead of criticizing you, start copying you. Okay? You get into the 1980s, and HMS Richards Jr. is an old man. And he's starting to get into very frail health. Such frail health that his wife, who lived to be, I think, 103 or 104, had to put him in a retirement home because she couldn't take care of him anymore. And the rumors started flying around that old HMS Richards was not going to die. The world was in such a way that the second coming was coming. It was going to happen, sure as can be. And proof is, the guy has to get out of his bed in his retirement community and say, nobody told me I wasn't going to get translated. In fact, he said, look at me. Look where I'm at. I'm probably am going to die. He did in 1985. Why in the world do we come up with these weird rumors? But you can see it here, that people who are so sure that the second coming of Jesus is going to happen, it's going to happen real quickly, that they would latch on to this and say, see, John isn't going to die. In the first century, there had been so many confusion things. The story is that the guy, one of the emperors, did try to kill him. He tried to boil him alive. And John wouldn't die. And that's how he ended up on the Isle of Patmos. The early church fathers say they tried to kill him before they put him on the Isle of Patmos. They wanted him dead. But what do you do when you can't kill somebody? Well, put him in a penal colony where you can bury him and he can't create any more trouble. That's how he ended up on the Isle of Patmos. You could see where people are saying, look at the miracles God did to keep John alive. John isn't going to die. And he even said so when he was talking to Peter. And John has to say, no, guys. The gospel is not about John. The gospel is about Jesus. Let's get this thing back in focus. The gospel is not about John. The gospel is about Jesus. The story of what happened with John was Jesus was rehabilitating Peter. John had nothing to do with it. Peter tried to change the subject about John. Jesus didn't. And am I ever glad that controversy happened? So that John would say, we need to add that to the book. Because with all the disaster that happened here and all the bad rumors, man, am I ever glad the story of Jesus rehabilitating Peter like that is solidly in the Bible. You ever been on anybody that could use some rehabilitation? Have you ever noticed we in the church are pretty good at saying, oh, we're comfortable with rehabilitating somebody who got them, fell head over teacup in a disaster before they became a Christian, oh, that's okay. We can have them. But boy, we have trouble when somebody falls head over teacup in the church. And notice what Jesus did with Peter in the church. You would put him in the category, he was basically the head elder of the church. Pretty close to being General Conference president, if you want to say it that way. And notice how Jesus handles him. Publicly. Rehabilitates him and says, you are still my disciple, and you are still my apostle. Woo. That's rehabilitation. And the reason I'm glad that misunderstanding happened to put it in the Bible is, folks, he wants to rehabilitate every one of us. Now, that doesn't mean go create and be a scandal. That doesn't mean go blow it. But it does mean that if we blow it, God is still God, and he still wants to rehabilitate. Period. There is no such thing as a sin that has us so far gone that God doesn't want to rehabilitate. Period. Does that make sense? So what's the story? Peter, you had a bad day. Now let's pick ourselves up, dust ourselves off, and get back to it again. Can I suggest, folks, if you've had a bad day, let's pick ourselves up, dust ourselves off. Thank the Lord for being a kind, forgiving God who went through a lot to become sin for us, so that we can pick ourselves up and dust ourselves off and start all over again. Does that make sense? Ever known anybody that could use it? This is the disciple who testifies these things and wrote these things. We know that his testimony is true. And there are also many others, things that Jesus did, which I suppose if they were written one on top of the other, the world could not contain the books. But remember this. Jesus is in the salvation business. Jesus is in the rehabilitation business. And Jesus wants to rehabilitate his people today just as much as he wanted to rehabilitate Peter a long time ago. Do we believe that? How many of us believe that? Now the next question is, do we believe that applies to us too? Most of us are pretty good at saying, yeah, I believe that for you over there. But it's a different story to look in the mirror and say, and it applies there too. Do we believe Jesus means that, what he says? Heavenly Father, thank you for rehabilitating Peter. Thank you for being in the rehabilitation business. And dear Father, if there's somebody here today that needs to experience or feel that yes, you are in the rehabilitation business, would you give them that experience this day? Would you remind all of us, you love us unconditionally. You'd rather have us not go making mistakes, but you know how to rehabilitate mistake makers. thank you, we ask in Jesus' name.